Hiya, good afternoon. So we're back now for session 3 of the second day of the Labour Market Conference. Next up is the sessions focus on differentiated labour markets and distributional issues. I'm really looking forward to this session. My PhD actually was on income inequality and looking at issues to do with the distribution and well-being. So it's an area that I haven't, since working in the NERI, haven't had much time to focus on. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where that body of research is at now and listening to the various papers. I'm going to continue on ahead into the session just so I don't eat into presenters' time. And first up, we've got Dr. Robert Sweeney from TASC, who will present a paper titled Income Inequality in Ireland. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I did a little test run just before I joined the session, and I was struggling to keep it within the time frame. So I'll skip some parts and hopefully I won't get flustered along the way. So what I'm going to do is look at the distribution of individual earnings in Ireland, and look at what are the causes of that, or the proximate causes anyway. And what I'll argue is that when you look at individual earnings, it's mostly a problem of low pay. And I also look at to what extent is it a structural problem and to what extent is it not a structural problem. And actually argue it's not so much a structural problem in the sense that it's not due to the fact that Ireland has, a large hospitality sector or anything like that. Okay, so that's one slide that I'll actually skip. So this graph here looks at labour income inequality in Ireland, and it measures that using the Gini coefficient. Higher Gini means higher inequality, and the white dot looks at inequality among the population, excluding retired people and students, and it's labour income inequality, meaning that it's inequality of employment and self-employment earnings, so the total income you get from work and how equally or unequally is that distributed. So we see that when you look at the population, excluding the retired people, Ireland and students, Ireland has an unequal distribution of labour income. And you might say, well, that's just because there are many people who are not at work. And well, that's not so much the case, actually. My pointer, okay, here it is. We see that this grey dot looks at the distribution of labour income just among people at work. So it excludes people who are not working. And again, we see that Ireland is one of the most unequal countries in the European Union. It's second now to Portugal. Well, you might also turn around and say that, well, that's just due to Ireland having lots of part-time workers. And so it's not really because wages are unequally distributed or anything like that. So what this bar does, it looks at the inequality of earnings controlling for working time. It uses a measure called full-time monthly equivalent income. It's a measure used by Eurofund, which I applied to the EU Silk data set, and it looks at how much earnings you would have if you were working full time. So it kind of controls for working time, basically. And what we see is that earnings still continue to be unequally distributed. So we're the third most unequal country in the European Union. Okay, so how can we explain that? So this chart here looks at where countries rank in terms of earnings inequality using the measure I just spoke about, full-time equivalent monthly income. And this axis here looks at where countries rank in terms of the prevalence of low pay. So for instance, this country, and obviously this country is Ireland here. So this country, whatever country it was, is number 25 in terms of inequality, and it's also number 25 in terms of the prevalence of low pay. So it has the highest level of earnings inequality and the highest prevalence of low pay. This country has the lowest prevalence of low pay. It's ranked number 1, but it's also ranked number 1 in terms of inequality, i.e. it's the most egalitarian. And in general, this is almost a straight line, meaning that countries which are unequal when it comes to earnings also have high rates of low pay, and Ireland is one of them. So both in Ireland and in other countries, the distribution of earnings, individual earnings, is very strongly connected to low pay. So this here looks at where Ireland's low pay workers are. Again, using the same measure that I used before, full-time monthly equivalent labor income. What this shows is that around a little bit over 3% of the workforce are low-paid workers in the hospitality sector. This shows that just under 3% of the workforce are low-paid workers, just over 3% of the workforce are low-paid workers in the retail sector. Just under 3% of the workforce are low-paid workers in the hospitality sector. This is a little bit different to the OECD measure of low pay, which looks only at full-time employees. So it generates slightly different values and lower values. We see that the wholesale retail sector and the hospitality sector are big generators of low-pay workers, but so is the public sector in Ireland. It's not that the public sector uses low pay intensively, that a big share of the public sector workforce are low-paid workers. It's just that the public sector is, it's the biggest sector. Okay, so then what I do is I look at to what extent our low pay is driven by our economic structure, and to what extent is it driven by, non-structural issues, or the fact that those sectors are just using low pay workers a lot. So what this white dot here does, it looks at how many low-paid workers we would have in the public sector if we replicated Finland's economic structure. So what I mean by that is, and let me kind of just get to my original screen here, because I have some notes here and it's kind of tricky to explain just off the top of my head, to be honest. So this dot here looks at what percentage of the workforce would be low paid if instead we had Finnish levels of public sector employment, but we retained the Irish portion of the public sector who are low paid. So what I mean by that is, suppose that currently 10% of the Irish public sector are low paid, just making that number up, and that 20% of the workforce are public servants in Ireland, and 30% of the workforce are public servants in Finland. This dot looks at, well, what would Ireland look like if instead of 20% of the workforce were in the public sector, 30% of the workforce were in the public sector, and we continued to have 10% of that bigger public sector low paid. So it looks at how many low paid workers we would have if we replicated Finland's economic structure. And we see that we would have more low paid public servants, because obviously Finland has a much bigger public sector workforce. We would have fewer wholesale and retail workers who are low paid. In general, we would have fewer low-paid workers if we replicated Finland's economic structure, but it's actually, it doesn't change things that much, basically. The black dots look at what would happen, or what would Ireland look like if we replicated Finland in terms of the intensity with which it uses low pay. And we retained our current economic structure. So let me just scroll down so I can explain that. So let me get rid of this. Okay, just bear with me for a second. So the black dots look at this. So here's hospitality and retail. So suppose that 20% of the Irish workforce are retail workers, and suppose that 40% of Irish retail workers are low paid, but only 10% of Finnish retail workers are low paid. The black dot represents how many low paid retail workers Ireland would have if it continued to have 20% of the workforce in the retail sector, but now only 10% of that workforce were low paid. So it replicates the intensity with which Finland uses low pay workers, whereas the white dots replicate Finland's economic structure. And we see that this has a more dramatic effect than the structural effects. So we see that we would have many fewer wholesale and retail sectors. We would have, so this is how many, so the blue bar is how many low paid wholesale and retail workers Ireland has. The white dot is how many we would have if we replicated Finland's economic structure. And the black dots represent how many low paid retail workers Ireland would have if we replicated the intensity with which Finland uses low paid workers in the retail sector. And in general, the black dots lower the percentage of the workforce we would have as low paid. It has a much more powerful effect than actually replicating the economic structure.
One minute, Robert.
Yeah. Okay, so just in conclusion, Ireland has high levels of labour income inequality. This cannot be explained by part-time work or participation issues. And low pay and inequality are strongly linked. And it is the intensity with which low pay is used in Ireland, not economic structure, at least when we compare Ireland to Finland, which explains Ireland's inequality. So it points more to, well, just raising the income of workers and not just structural issues. Structural issues have a role to play, but they're not the main factor. So that's it.
Very interesting, Robert. Thanks very much for that. I'm just going to pull up the questions here. So yeah, you mentioned there, one of the questions you said, you mentioned there that it's not the structure of employment, which seems to be important here. It's the intensity of pay within particular sectors. So you suggest that it's not changing the structure of employment across Ireland, which might correct this issue. But how might policy respond, or, you know, to increase or reduce the intensity of low pay within particular sectors? Do you think we need sectoral, you know, to deal with low pay sectorally, or can we deal with low pay, you know, broad brush and kind of right across our economy?
So yeah. So when I say it's not structural issues, just to be more precise, is if we replicated Finland's economic structure, we would not reduce our low pay by that much. Obviously, I only compared Ireland to Finland. I used Finland because it is a country with low rates of low pay. As to how we can address this, I think it does vary sector by sector. If you look at the hospitality sector in Ireland, profit margins are quite slim. So if you say implemented a living wage overnight, you know, just forgetting about the pandemic for a minute, because profit margins are quite slim, that would raise prices and ultimately probably result in fewer people going to restaurants. On the other hand, the retail sector has much higher profit margins, and it has a much greater capacity for increasing wages without adverse employment effects. And also the public sector, it's just a matter of choice. So I think it does vary sector by sector. You could do this through a variety of means, sector by sector, collective bargaining, would be perhaps ideal. You know, absent that, implement a living wage gradually, or you could have sectoral employment orders or something like that, which set minimum rates in each sector. So there's a variety of mechanisms you can do to address that.
And we just have about another minute, but another question is, so your data is showing the wholesale and retail sector obviously to be most likely to be low paid. Yeah. Going forward in the COVID crisis, what do you think the implications of this is likely to be, as we're likely going to see an increase in wholesale and maybe a reduction from the traditional retail? So what do you think in terms of low pay going forward?
Low pay going forward, that's
for the sector, wholesale and retail.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, I have to say. I mean, it's hard. It's going to be hard to argue that we should have large wage increases in the next year, to be honest with you. And it looks like that, although, you know, we will probably bounce back from this crisis faster than we did the previous crisis because we have all these accumulated savings and whatnot, it does look like some of these jobs are never going to come back. And so we could have a smaller hospitality sector for the foreseeable future. I think once the dust settles on this crisis, the best way is to look at it sector by sector. Perhaps employment orders, you know, obviously collective bargaining is ideal because in that way you can tailor your policy to the needs of the sector and minimize potential adverse effects. So I don't think that's a great answer. I'm just kind of repeating what I said.
The sectoral employment orders is certainly. Yeah. I'm going to have to end it there with you, Robert. And I don't know if you have stopped sharing screen. I'm just going to move on to our next speaker, which is from Dr. Mathew Creighton from UCD, which is focused on anti-immigrant sentiment and educational mobility in Europe. If you turn on your camera, maybe, Mathew. Yep. And then I'm just going to as well hand it over to you, give you 10 minutes. If you know, I'll give you a 2-minute warning, you know, if you're not closing to near the end, and then we'll move to the Q&A. So you can start sharing your slides if you like.
Do you see him?
We can't see slides yet, Mathew.
You can't, huh? Great. It should be showing up, but I'll try again.
Yeah.
You got it now, yeah?
It's just saying yeah, that's it now.
Okay. So I'm gonna switch gears. I thank you, by the way. I learned a lot actually in the past few presentations. I'm going to do what sociologists typically do to the discussion and deviate from anything useful. So we're going to talk about mobility in particular. So it does relate to structure, but it's kind of maybe a less material aspect of it. So this is work that was done at UCD Curie because we coordinate the European Social Survey there, and so this was a useful insight that could be gleaned from it. Daniel and Monica aren't here, but they were also important for this work as it developed. So we'll talk about a little bit about populism in the sense that we were focused on one, or considering one of the two, the relationship between the two leading explanations for kind of a big shift in kind of political momentum towards governance that's hard to manage on a left-right scale, let's say. And one of them focused on mobility, the kind of aspects of variety of contexts that were left behind, stagnant in terms of you could think of almost as optimism. And the other one was immigration, which, if you know, a lot of research in political science in particular has pointed out, is really populism is an incoherent term, but if there is something coherent about it, the relationship has to do with the or at least the perception of immigration in a variety of contexts. So this is what we were interested in, was this relationship here. We knew a lot about education. So we knew that education has this kind of broad finding of it's always associated with tolerance. Now, work that actually, following me, there'll be a presentation, work with Fran and Eamonn were part of that paper, and we did some stuff at ESRI that suggested that educational attainment's not so easy to interpret. But by and large, you find that people who have more education on issues like immigration, but also in a variety of other things, tend to at least express a greater level of tolerance. We knew that one's own education has this kind of gradient to it. We also knew that it was very tightly conditioned by contextual norms. There's huge variation into how education plays out when thinking about anti-immigrant sentiment or kind of anything. We also knew about parents' education. So when we were thinking about mobility or upward or downward, we knew that parents' education is typically interpreted through the lens of socialization. So the relationship between the experiences that parents impart on children and how those shape their perception going on. We also, most of this work is done on thinking about kind of politics, so kind of political ideology and a few other value sets in social psychology. But it becomes quite, I mean, sadly, all of us are quickly become old dogs and very difficult to teach new tricks. So things like prejudice or stereotypes and assumptions about out groups can solidify quite early. But certain stages of the educational trajectory are particularly influential. It's one reason that religious education tends to start early, is because we're quite susceptible the younger we are. So the only meager evidence that downward mobility leads to frustration, it's not really all that clear. There's not actually, in a lot of contexts, that much downward mobility on education, unless there's some sort of big exogenous crisis that disrupts the system, insert COVID. But the effect of education are stronger in countries with longstanding democracies, religious heterogeneity. These are because in the educational process, you might, in the general explanations, you might encounter things you wouldn't otherwise because of that institutional setting. So we looked at the ESS, which is the European Social Survey. In particular, we looked kind of post-2008 because I had some measures on education, particularly for parents, that we could look at. We actually, there's some aspects of this is under peer review that we got even later. ESS 9, we wrapped up and were able to incorporate. ESS 10, who knows? I don't know why anyone would let us in their house at this exact moment, but we'll certainly try. The education we looked at was just a kind of simple 3-level education. This is fairly typical in international comparative work because it's hard to compare education systems in too refined a detail. So we do some better work, not presented here, in terms of getting at the nuance of educational systems, which are quite divergent. Parental education had the same kind of 3-part aspect to it. And then we looked at a lot of different measures, but what I'll talk about today is these kind of perceptions of immigration, kind of broad perceptions of immigration, and they kind of go from a better to worse. It's a 10 scale, it's 11-point scale actually, because it starts with 0, and we'll be looking at averages really. So how do we do this? Mobility is really hard to look at, particularly as a predictor, because it's typically an outcome. So like my parents' education, and then I end up somewhere. But looking at mobility as a process for some sort of other outcome can be kind of computationally confusing. Because they're so closely related. There is some innovation in this, and so we were looking at a class of models, I suppose, to look at this, which has has gained a lot of traction in recent years, but also some notable criticism, a valid criticism of it. But these came about in the 80s, then were promptly forgotten, like most things in the 80s, and now they're cool again, like most things in the 80s. So we were looking at the outcome of immigration, but what these models allow you to do is to consider the diagonals. And so you look at your parents' education, you look at your own education, and you develop a set of weights for a given context that look at kind of deviations from on a mobility table from like a perfect reproduction. So low education, medium education. And what this tries to do is it tries to ask questions about mobility or the meaning of mobility in contexts where you have big differences in terms of the distribution of education. So we're just looking at deviations from a reproduction perspective rather than taking into account the kind of structural differences, in other words, the proportions that fall into these different levels. So you create a set of weights effectively, and what this does is create a very different landscape than one might intuitively understand about education. It's something that isn't widely, but it's known, but it's not widely kind of presented. So like if you look at, these are just some countries that I pulled out, we look at many more, but if you look at Ireland's the second column, if you look at these contexts, the respondent is you can think of these sum to 1, it's the overall weights, and then you can think of the other kind of predictors that go in there. But you can look in some contexts like Norway or Ireland, and the respondent's education, in other words, our own education for those that, regardless of where you end up, it carries a lot of weight. In other words, the other attributes of us in terms of understanding attitudes towards immigration are more substantive in predicting the outcome. Other contexts, so that would be Norway, Ireland, and then the ESS also. So broadly speaking, across all contexts that we can study with the European Social Survey, you get that pattern. Other places, it's not so clear. Poland, Austria, you get a more dominant role of parental education. And this is real meaning for understanding what individual characteristics, the implications of individual characteristics in terms of shaping levels of tolerance, let's say. So this is across all waves. And what we're looking at here is just on the left, or my left, stage left, you'll see, oh no, stage right, I never remember. So is country a worse or better place to live by people coming to live here from other countries? And you'll be just looking at averages here. So kind of higher values would be a relatively more negative perception of immigration. And as you move across the mobility table, let's say from low in terms of parents' education to high in terms of respondents' education, you get a lower values, meaning that that sense of negativity is attenuated by having that shift from a lower education to higher education. And depending on the context, that will be more attributed to where you start or where you end up, the weight of your parent or the weight of your own experience. At medium education, you see the same kind of trajectory. This is across all contexts. And you can kind of look the other way too. So downward mobility, so from, let's say, in the middle, if you like the bullseye, the middle of the 3.49 there, if you start in the medium and then your parents were medium and then you shift towards lower education, you also see the change in direction. Presenting it like this, which are just kind of predicted average values, you can kind of also look across categories and you can ask questions. For example, if you go from low to high and you end up with a high level of education, how does that compare to someone whose parents also had a high level of education? You could see that it's not exactly the same. In other words, one's own education, depending on context, has very different implications once you understand something about educational origins. This is the case of Ireland. Ireland has a similar pattern, but you'll notice quite a big gap, which I'll get to in a second. So Ireland, where one's own education is quite meaningful for the perception of immigration, you see, for example, if you have a high level of mobility, a very, very large change in the average expected perception of immigration towards the positive or more favorable view of it relative to other contexts. And those that are most educated, intergenerationally so, have in Europe some of the lowest levels of antipathy towards immigration observed. That would be the 1.73 in the bottom right. This is another way to look at it here. So if you see Ireland on the left, these are just calculated differences in the kind of predicted average perception of immigration. And you can see how far Ireland stands out. So the blue column here would just be for those that experience just looking at those whose parents have relatively low levels of education.
2 minutes now, Matthew.
Yep, I think there's only one more slide. And then you go up to medium, you'll see the blue line, you get a pretty non-trivial reduction. But if you look at the kind of the largest gap, which is from low levels of education to the highest, you get a very, very large gap. And if you look over on the far right, Poland, which if you recall, parental education was more meaningful, that level of that big change in education intergenerationally doesn't lead to much change or a very large shift in perception of immigration. So we have a lot of variation in context. We saw, when you look at it this way, a tremendous variation across country contexts that have a lot to do with the meaning of parental education in terms of attitudes towards immigrants and how much weight that carries. Social origins really matter in some places. Ireland wouldn't be a place like that as much. But in some places they can be almost completely dominant. And then destinations are better understood through the lens of one's own education. So some contexts really you can look at the current educational experience and understand it much better. Some cases you learn very little from that. So in terms of education, destination effects are some of the strongest in Europe, in Ireland, that would be. And upward mobility leads to relatively large shifts in perspective, uniquely large shifts in perspective. Now, in other work, we looked at education. When the higher level of education, people tend to be a bit deceptive about how tolerant they are. So you do have a bit of that. So maybe this would be overly optimistic, perhaps. And there's a widening gap. You see a very large gap in experience between different forms of mobility. So that's it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Matthew. Sorry, I'm just going to I've got a question, and it relates to, I think, I was just trying to figure out, I think it relates to your slide number 12, and it's really about when you touched on that issue of how people who've went from low to high educational outcomes compared to those whose parents started off with high. I think the person just wanted you to kind of go back and kind of just elaborate on that a little bit more, that just that point, just to clarify.
This one?
No, before that, this one, yeah.
Okay, so these are, you can think of these are simple predicted values, in that that's the average expected perception of immigration on that 0 to 10 point scale. And then these are through the lens of a model that allows for variation in weighting. So meaning that it accounts for the relative importance or influence of parents' education, respondents' education. So when you're interpreting these values, it's not real life. I mean, this is kind of regressive hyperspace, but it does allow you to try to understand the relative importance of these values, and the larger gaps are meaningful. In other words, you can interpret the change between those. Is that helpful?
Yeah. And then just let me check the time. I'm actually going to have to move on. I would love to have a bit more time to talk to you. You know, obviously there's not, social origins is clearly important here, but I'd love to have no doubt a longer conversation about what the other potential influences are, you know, so, you know, it's not, you know, a definitive thing that, you know, social origins is going to...
Yeah, fair enough. No, this is just to kind of understand how that's patterned. This isn't a causal model. There's no expectation here that parents' education make you more tolerant. Just in context where parents' education has a certain weight, you can expect different average outcomes. Now that could be conditioned by a variety of things, and we try to deal with that more.
Very interesting. Well, thank you, Matthew. And I'm going to move quickly on, just trying to stick with time, to our last presentation in this session, which is from Dr. Ivan Privalko from the ESRI, which again is a joint paper with Associate Research Professor Francis McGinnity, Mr. Eamonn Fahey, and Ms. Shannen Enright. And this paper looks at labour market integration in Ireland, migration channels, ethnicity, and Irish citizenship. And again, I'll give you 10 minutes. If you're going to, if you feel like you're not reaching the end of your slide, I'll just give you a reminder that there's 2 minutes left, just so we can allow that little bit of time for questions. But over to you, Ivan.
Ivan, if you could just unmute there.
Sorry, guys. Can everybody see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi all. Thanks very much for logging on, and thank you to NERI for inviting us, especially to Louisa and Paul for their help getting us a slot in the conference. I'm Ivan, and I'll be presenting Labour Market Integration in Ireland, which is a paper I'm working on with ESRI colleagues. Our paper considers migrant integration using the full Irish census. We're really lucky to have this data, so I would also like to thank the CSO for providing it. It considers all migrants who are in the census for that year. So in terms of research questions, we asked 3 questions. Does the channel used by migrants to arrive in Ireland have a significant effect on unemployment? Can this effect be explained by migrant characteristics or selection? And does Irish citizenship, which in this case we're treating as Irish nationality, does that matter for migrants in terms of unemployment? So for Irish citizenship, we're thinking about Irish nationality, but when we talk about migrants, we're going to be thinking about people born outside of the Republic of Ireland. And for the purpose of the paper, we are treating people born in Northern Ireland as migrants. That wasn't fully our choice, but it's kind of the direction that we're taking for now. So I mean, in general, we think that migrant routes into Ireland are important. Although measures like human capital and time spent in Ireland are strong predictors, we basically suspect that the method that migrants use to arrive in Ireland will have lasting effects which go beyond those measures, like, you know, their education or their English language ability. And these effects are kind of like the scarring effects that you sometimes hear of in long-term unemployment research. So for EU migrants, you know, the mechanism that they use to arrive in Ireland is really basic. It's just the free movement of workers. But for non-EU migrants, there are a couple of channels that can have an impact. Mainly the international protection system, work permits, and some student migration, although family reunification is also important here. So there's already some research done on these effects. So Bakker and Heinmuller have reported that refugees report worse labour market outcomes when they're compared to other migrants. So migrants who are not refugees typically, you know, have less unemployment. They integrate better into the labour market. And then for Ireland, there's some research done by Philip O'Connell. So we're trying to build on his research that says that when you come through the protection system, this can have a significant negative effect for certain migrant groups. And the literature does say that kind of skills and qualifications can mitigate some of these effects. So, you know, migrants who have higher education tend to report better labour market outcomes than other migrant groups. And also host country language can be really important in these types of models. So we also expect that beyond those things, there'll be some level of ethnic discrimination in the models. So I mean, this is just well documented in the literature that you know, in Western labour markets, it's routinely reported that ethnic minorities report worse outcomes than other groups. And there's some evidence for this in Ireland as well, where black ethnic minorities report worse outcomes than white migrant groups or white groups, and that's regardless of migrant status. So just a pure ethnicity effect, you know, we would expect that to explain some of the variation in unemployment across migrant groups. So the last thing that we're kind of looking at is the impact of host country citizenship, and the literature is a bit fuzzy on this. So, you know, sometimes it's associated, I suppose that the key phrase here is naturalization. Sometimes it's associated with better outcomes, sometimes there's no effect, and sometimes the effect can lead to a penalty. And a lot of authors are kind of suggesting that you know, this effect kind of depends on the migrant group. So, you know, we're kind of of two minds of what this effect is going to be. So here are hypotheses for this paper. Basically, the first two and the last two are linked. So the first two are just about the channels that migrants use to arrive in Ireland. So we would expect that EEA migrants fare better than non-EEA migrants in terms of unemployment. But within that group, the non-EEA migrants, we basically suspect that, like, if they have an association with the international protection system, that will have a negative impact on their labour market chances, independent of all the other controls. So that brings me on to hypothesis 2, which just says that human capital is important. This is a standard control in all of these projects and research papers. Those with more education, more English language ability will fare better than those without. Then we have that kind of ethnicity effect that I mentioned earlier. So black migrants will be more likely to be unemployed than white migrants, regardless of the migration channel or the human capital or any of the other stuff I kind of mentioned earlier. And then the last two are kind of tied to that citizenship point. So we expect that migrants with Irish citizenship, those who say they're Irish nationals, will be less likely to be unemployed when we compare them to migrants without Irish nationality. And then the last kind of hypothesis on that point is just tied to maybe that effect depends on whether they're non-EEA migrants, so migrants from outside the European Economic Area. So the methods that we use, we're using the full Irish census for 2016. There's 4.7 million observations in there, but we're only interested in people born outside of Ireland. and those who basically don't say that their country of birth is a residual group like other Africa or other Asia. So once we take out people who are aged 1564, we're left with about 360,000 observations, and from over 120 countries. So we use logistic regression with robust standard errors to estimate the relationship, and we're looking at a number of controls. So I've already mentioned them previously. We're interested in the channel that they use to arrive in Ireland. We're interested in their ethnicity, their citizenship, and some human capital and compositional measures. So here are our results following the logistic regression. These are listed in odds ratio. So value of higher than 1 has a positive effect on unemployment, and values below 1 have a negative effect. So, you know, the model controls for all of the things I mentioned previously. And straight off the bat, we see that, you know, EEA migrants have significantly lower odds of unemployment when compared to non-EEA migrants. So that's the first hypothesis confirmed there. You know, they're independent of human capital and all those other things. You know, being a migrant from inside the European Economic Area has a positive effect in that, you know, they're less likely to cite unemployment. Now, within that non-EEA group, there is a negative effect in terms of coming through the protection system. So even when you consider education, even when you consider English language ability and all the other factors, you know, you are significantly more likely to cite unemployment. And that's significant as well. So we confirm that second hypothesis too. In terms of education, you know, the usual results are there. Those with tertiary education report very low odds of citing unemployment relative to people with the minimal level of education. And then here, if we look at English language ability, we kind of find the same thing. You know, people who speak no English language at all, they have 2 times greater odds of citing unemployment than those who speak English very well. So, and there seems to be a sliding scale there in terms of English. So really, really important. So our human capital measures are kind of confirmed there. You know, the more human capital that people have, the less likely they are to cite unemployment. Now, in terms of ethnicity, we do find a negative effect among the Black migrant group. So they're significantly higher. They have significantly higher odds of citing unemployment, but this effect isn't found for the Asian and the other ethnicities. Thanks. Yeah, and so even when we consider, you know, the channel that they use to arrive in Ireland, their human capital, their English language ability, it does look like the Black ethnic group has an additional kind of penalty attached to their participation in the labour market. So we can kind of confirm that hypothesis. Now, for Irish citizenship, we don't find an effect. Basically, there's no significant difference between migrants who are Irish citizens and those who aren't. And we weren't expecting this, so we kind of looked into it a bit further with an interaction. So we are looking at an interaction between being an Irish citizen and being born inside the European Economic Area or outside the European Economic Area. So once we have this interaction, everything kind of lights up. You know, there's significance all over the place here. So, you know, being an EEA migrant, again, you're likely to report lower unemployment. Being an Irish national, you're likely to report lower unemployment, but there's an interaction between these things. And just because interaction effects are a bit hard to read, the predicted probabilities kind of explain it a bit better. So for the all migrant group, which is the first column there, it seems like being an Irish citizen actually increases your chances of being unemployed if you're from inside the EU. But the opposite is true if you're outside the EU. So the group that's outside the EU, who's naturalized, they actually report lower unemployment. So previously, what we're looking at in the bottom row there is the effect is being pulled apart, basically. So you know, very, very different effects depending on where the person was born. So our natural thought was to kind of take those who are from the UK, Northern Ireland, out of the model And what we found is the effect actually grew. So if you're from the EU, naturalization seems to be associated with higher unemployment, but if you're from outside the EU, naturalization seems to be associated with lower unemployment. And we're going to have to dig more into that later. So a quick summary of the findings. We find that the mechanism of entry is really important for migrant integration. We also find the human capital is a strong predictor, as is duration in Ireland, although there are some issues with that measure. We find the usual gaps in ethnicity, and we find that the effect of Irish citizenship is just very complex, and we're still looking into that. There are a couple of limitations, but generally we're pretty confident with the findings that we have. It's important to note that we only look at the first generation of migrants. So thanks very much for listening, and the full report is actually available at the website, although we're turning it into a paper at the minute. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan. We only have time for one question, and it's related to whether or not, and you might consider this in your fill paper, I'm not sure, but it's related to whether or not a decomposition of your coefficients would show how much of the gap in outcomes for non-EE migrants versus EE migrants is being explained by your different explanatory variables there. Can you attribute, do we know, I think the question is, do we know how much each factor is impacting each separately, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I don't have those that result in front of me, but we should probably report it. I should say we just got these results cleared today, so our presentation looks a bit different to what we sent over, but no, I'll have to look that up, to be honest.
Nothing like a conference coming up to push results to be.
Yeah, we're very lucky.
Very good. I'm just going to have to leave that there, though, Ivan, just because we're pushed for time. We're actually just running over a little bit, so just want to make sure, given it's Friday afternoon, that the two people in the very last session have their time. But thanks very much for everybody in the session. It was really interesting, covering a diverse range of issues right across, from I suppose pure economics, the sociology, and the various distributional issues in terms of characteristics there. I'm going to finish now, and Paul has put the link for the next session up onto the chat function, and that is going to just have the two papers, one from our very own Tom McDonald, who's going to be in the session to focus on after COVID. But thanks very much. So I think we're going to resume in a few minutes with the new link there in the chat function. But thank you.